Good afternoon. Warm welcome to everyone in the room and also those who are joining us on Zoom. Um, Let me also extend a warm welcome to a dear former colleague who is now a senior visiting fellow at CPR. And it's wonderful to have someone who has spent a lot of time trying to understand various facets of Indian foreign policy as deeply and thought about it as deeply as you have, Rani, and the wealth of experience that you do to this conversation. The Development Cooperation Project, where she and her team did extensively mapped and mapped and tried to make sense of India's role as a development partner and as donor. And also its economic diplomacy in the region, among other things. So I think so today she is going to talk to us about realism without alignment, India's strategic autonomy in an era of US uncertainty. So I think as an idea, strategic autonomy has a curious paradox at its heart. It is at once one of the most debated ideas in Indian foreign policy, and also among the least defined. It means different things to different people. It is a contested discourse, and it has also created it created more heat than light for a variety of reasons. And I think perhaps one reason why we tend to get the term or the idea wrong is because we tend to obsess over what it is, and over which there is tremendous amount of differences, with critics even dismissing its validity and calling it as more performative than productive. So I think one way perhaps useful way would be to kind of turn it on its head and look at what strategic autonomy is not. So, and perhaps that's one reason, in a way, the similar tenor in which your title is perhaps framed. And there, I think a little bit more clarity emerges, because we are clear that, at least in terms of that strategic autonomy is not a term that is an end in itself. It's not meant to, at least. Never mind the kind of confusion and flawed assumptions that very often are part of the discourse. It is also not about being equidistant from powers. It is not also about isolationism. So, long story short, the idea itself is really, I think, we need to also, and there's also, it's also useful, just take a couple of more minutes to say that there's fair bit of conceptual clarity we get if we look beyond IR to look at, for instance, how autonomy itself is theorized in, say, political theory to mean capacity of your political community to act without or govern without external constraint. There's a very interesting work in European international law, for instance, the taxonomy developed by Armin Steinbach, who unpacks the idea of autonomy into various dimensions, disparate components that make up this very divisive concept. And there's also this fascinating work by the political scientist Karen Litvin, whose work on sovereignty, with her work on sovereignty bargains, where she talks about the trade-offs that countries make between autonomy, control, and legitimacy. So that, in a sense, is a long story short, is a reminder that this is not a set of questions that are unique only to India. And also a reminder, a very valuable, useful reminder, because we tend to slide into navel gazing a lot when we talk about this. So with those words, let me turn to Rani and request you to make your presentations. Would 40 minutes be sufficient?
I think that would be great.
Okay.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank CPR so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure to come back, to maintain my affiliation, and my affiliation goes back to my dissertation research days and having an affiliation here. So I'm always very pleased to be able to come back and see old friends and colleagues here. So thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me time and space to discuss this issue. So today I wanted to discuss a central puzzle in India's foreign policy. Because over the past decades, really over the past 3 decades, we've seen an Indian partnership with the United States, which has deepened dramatically. The two countries, as you now know, cooperate across a wide range of areas, including defense, technology, trade, and the Indo-Pacific. Yet, despite this deepening partnership, if you want to call it that, India has consistently resisted formal alliance commitments with the US. Why, you might ask? My argument today is that India's behavior reflects a strategy that I call realism without alignment. This is a strategy that has allowed India to expand cooperation with major powers while still enabling it to preserve its long-standing commitments to strategic autonomy. However, the international environment that made this strategy successful is now changing, and is actually changing rapidly. Under US President Donald Trump, the United States has increasingly disrupted the post-war international order through tariff wars, through transactional diplomacy, and unilateral military actions. These developments are weakening alliances and multilateral institutions while encouraging a much more fragmented global and more competitive international order. It is in this environment that I argue realism without alignment may actually be reaching the limits, its own limits in terms of its capacity to be beneficial to India. Instead, India may increasingly need to combine strategic autonomy with coalition building among middle powers in order to preserve its strategic interests and to help shape the emerging multipolar order. So if you could just go to the second slide, please. So the puzzle then, let me begin with this puzzle or reiterate it, is that since the end of the Cold War, India-US relations have been strategic. Sorry. I can do it. I can do it. Yes, thought that it was right here. Okay, all right. It has the relationships have deepened dramatically. We have seen a rapprochement that really began in the 1990s and accelerated under successive US administrations. Bill Clinton, George Bush, both played significant roles in transforming the bilateral relationship. The most important turning point came in 2005, as you know, with the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. That agreement symbolized a major shift in US policy towards India It effectively recognized India as a legitimate nuclear power. It broadened the acceptance of India as a rising power, and it signaled Washington's willingness to cooperate with India in an international global order rather than isolating India. Since then, as you know, cooperation has expanded, defense cooperation has deepened significantly. In the technology sector, there have been many partnerships that have grown. Trade and investment cooperation has also increased, and security cooperation, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, has also risen. Yet, despite these developments, India has consistently resisted entering into a formal alliance with the United States. This raises, I think, an important question. Why has India chosen cooperation without alliance? So what then is India's strategy? To understand this puzzle, we need to look at the broader logic of India's foreign policy. India's strategy can best be described as realism without alignment. The core principles underlying this policy of the strategy of strategic autonomy is one where India wants to preserve its strategic autonomy. At the same time, it also has tried to diversify its partnerships and wants to avoid depending on any single great power. And we have seen this, that in the post-Cold War world, however, this concept has evolved into something slightly different. Rather than maintaining sort of equidistance, as you mentioned, from Nimmi, from major powers, India has begun engaging with multiple powers simultaneously. And this approach is what one can think of as multi-alignment. So India cooperates with major powers, but avoids formal alliance commitments that might constrain its freedom of. So what does that actually look like in practice? It means that India is simultaneously looking to deepen its security ties, for example, with the United States, and that it, while it's doing so, also maintains defense ties with Russia. It engages with China economically, even as strategic competition between these two countries has intensified. It has expanded its partnerships with Japan, Europe, as well as ASEAN countries and other countries across the global south. So rather than choosing sides in the what one could call great power competition, India has pursued the strategy of strategic hedging. This allows India to preserve flexibility as it engages and sort of tries to buttress its rise without, and at the same time, it enables it to avoid becoming dependent on any single major power, including the United States. So I tried to sort of map out how I think of this. India sits at the center of a network of partnerships that extend in multiple directions, right? It has one connection links it to the United States, reflecting growing defense, technology ties, and cooperation. Another, the linkage to the EU above is sort of this connection where economic technology ties are expanding, and now particularly with the recent FTA agreement. And yet India also maintains ties with Russia, ASEAN countries, and partnerships across the global south. In addition, India is increasingly working with other middle powers such as Japan, Australia, etc. The key here is that India is trying to maximize its flexibility by engaging multiple sources of power simultaneously. Why has this strategy worked? So this strategy of realism without alignment worked particularly well during the post-Cold War international order. And there's several structural conditions that made this possible. One was that the US provided leadership in a relatively stable global security framework. The second was that multilateral institutions structured economic cooperation and helped manage disputes, whether we can think of the WTO or the IMF. Third, globalization expanded economic opportunities for rising powers like India. Emerging economies. And together, these conditions created strategic space for rising powers like India to sort of help their rise. In other words, India was able to pursue its economic growth, expand diplomatic partnerships, increase its global influence without having to choose sides in the great power competition. So what then has changed? We're at an inflection point where this favorable international environment has begun to unravel, as you all know. There are several major factors. One of them is China. China's growing military capacity, its expanding presence in the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific, and its strategic partnership with Pakistan have all increased the security concerns for India. Military confrontation along the Himalayan border, expanding Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, infrastructure investments in neighboring countries from Bangladesh to Sri Lanka, and strategic cooperation that has been ongoing for decades, but seems to have picked up between China and Pakistan. These developments pushed India towards deeper cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners. At the same time, the broader international system, as we speak today, is becoming more fragmented. Multilateral institutions are weakening. Economic coercion is becoming more common, particularly, and sadly, I have to say, from the United States. And the great power rivalry is in many ways intensifying. This environment is narrowing the strategic space, the strategic environment that previously allowed India to pursue a multi-alignment strategy, right? So that strategic space has decreased. And then, the Trump disruption. I'm sure you all know about it. I just thought I would make a couple points on this. This strategic autonomy alone may no longer provide sufficient leverage from India. Why? Because the return of Donald Trump to the presidency has accelerated many of the trends that we already saw, that were already there, but have sharpened, really. Now, President Trump's foreign policy, as you all know, is very transactional. I, in fact, gave a talk on that a year and a half ago here at CPR, or a bit ago at the beginning of President Trump's tenure. It relies heavily, as we have increasingly seen, on tariff wars, I would call them, and bilateral bargaining and pressure on allies and partners, including India. Trump has shown skepticism towards traditional alliances, as well as skepticism towards multilateral institutions. The result today is a more fragmented international system. Instead of negotiating through institutions, or alliances, countries are increasingly finding themselves negotiating individually with major powers. This strategy of the US in particular of divide and rule diplomacy places many middle powers and rising powers at a disadvantage. Turning specifically to India-US relations under Trump, today reflect both cooperation as well as tension, that relationship. On the positive side, you continue to have defense cooperation is not only continuing, in many ways it has deepened. Two countries continue to expand their military interoperability, strengthening technology partnerships, and coordinating closely in the Indo-Pacific. However, tensions have increased in several areas. These include tariffs that have been imposed on certain Indian exports, as well as across the board tariffs. There are also the issue of restrictions on H-1B visa holders that have created concerns for Indian professionals. And trade negotiations have increasingly become difficult, particularly regarding agriculture and market access for India. And just also to mention, energy policy has also become part of the bargaining process, as we now see with regard to Russia and Iran. These developments have illustrated that the bilateral relationship is increasingly transactional, and that it poses a dilemma for India. Turning to the Iran war, which is just in its first week here, how much the world has changed. The ongoing conflict between the US and Iran further illustrates the challenges that India faces. India has, as you know, maintained ties not only with the United States, but also with Israel, as well as Iran, as well as a multiplicity of other Gulf states. Balancing these multiple relationships has become increasingly difficult for India. And it poses risks for India's economy and to India's diaspora. The expansion of the conflict into maritime domains also affects India's security environment in the Indian Ocean. It impacts India's energy autonomy. It's altogether creates a situation that places significant pressure on India's strategy of strategic autonomy. So as one looks at the world, and particularly at the changing sort of, what has happened in the past week in particular, I think increasingly what I think is clear to me, and this is, I'd love to hear feedback from you, but to me, the whole Iran war has illustrated the limits of India's acting alone, India's strategic autonomy policy. And they really pose a fundamental question. Can realism, without any alignment, still deliver the same benefits to India that it has over the past decades? Strategic autonomy remains an important principle for India. However, in an increasingly fragmented international order, and by the way, it doesn't look like that's going to change, certainly not during the remainder of Trump's tenure, even if the midterm elections should, which will be taking place in November of this year, even if it brings in a democratic House and or Senate, it is unlikely to change the dynamic for countries such as India. So this question in this increasingly fragmented international system order, acting alone may actually place powers like India at a disadvantage, right? So that's where I've kind of gone with my thinking about how is India navigating this war? How does one understand how India gets to its strategic interests? When major powers negotiate bilaterally, smaller states often face asymmetric bargaining power. But that's not limited only to smaller states. In this current environment, it makes it also harder for rising powers like India to shape global outcomes. Okay, so here I'm kind of, juxtaposing the previous or current policy with where one can maybe think where Indian policy could go. And that is to think about where it might evolve from strategic autonomy to coalition realism, I call it, India's strategic evolution. One possible response to the challenge that one most clearly has seen crystallized by the events this past week in Iran and the larger region now, is that I would like to discuss what I call coalition-based realism. Instead of relying solely on autonomy, India could strengthen cooperation with other middle powers. Potential partners could include countries such as Japan, Australia, Indonesia, South Korea, Brazil, European Union countries, etc. These countries share several interests with India. They support open trade, they have democratic interests, they value maritime stability, and they generally favor a more balanced, multipolar international order. So whereas strategic autonomy and hedging across major powers worked in an environment where, under Biden and even under Trump 1.0, the US kind of looked the other way while India continued to engage with Russia, continue in terms of defense cooperation, in terms of buying oil from Russia. The environment has changed significantly over the past year, right? Bilateral diplomacy and maximizing flexibility worked in that environment where the US was supportive of India's rise and kind of tolerated, I would say, these other engagements of India. That environment has changed quite a bit. And I think it's in what is increasingly a fragmented global system, I think it is important for India to think again about not to drop strategic autonomy, but to maintain strategic autonomy as well as engage with coalitions, to cooperate with other middle powers, to engage in collective bargaining. There's strength in numbers rather than sort of one-on-one engagement. To think about institutional partnerships, multilateral engagement, where India works with other powers. The upshot of this kind of coalition-based realism would be a greater ability to shape the newly emerging multipolar world order. So really, I've raced through it a little bit further, but to get us to think really about what that might look like, the coalition-based realism, to engage with potential partners. And I just briefly also wanted to talk about I have the EU, the recent India-EU free trade agreement, because while it is an agreement just on the free trade side, this is really, I think, where India should be managing and pushing its comparison, right? Coalitions increase leverage and stability. So when we look at the India-EU free trade agreement just of earlier this year, there was clear win-win for both sides to have a FTA come about, right? Yet the reality is that this FTA was being negotiated for 20 years. 20 years. Win-win for both sides, and yet there was no conclusion until recently. And you have to ask why. Why now, right? Because there are clear interests on technology, trade, supply chains, etc. Clearly, in an environment where the US is putting up trade barriers, trying to decrease those trade barriers and expand trade with other regions is important for India. It is also in this environment much more important for India to think about diversification of its economic partnership and reducing the dependence on any single power. And so I think it's not coincidental that India was much more willing to actually, ink the agreement earlier this year. And I think it's this kind of coalition-based diplomacy that would really serve India better than the policy it has pursued to date. So just 3 brief reflections in conclusion. First, realism without alignment has served India well in the past. It allowed India to preserve strategic autonomy while expanding its global partnerships and India's influence. Second, the international environment that made this strategy successful is changing rapidly now. The erosion of the post-World War order, the intensification of great power rivalry, the increasingly transactional nature of international politics, particularly on the US side, are narrowing the space for independent maneuver. This suggests that India's foreign policy may be entering a new phase. Strategic autonomy will remain central to India's worldview. It has been really in different formats there since India's independence. However, strategic autonomy alone may not be sufficient for India. Instead, India may increasingly need to combine autonomy with building of strategic coalitions. If realism without alignment helped India rise within the post-Cold War order, then coalition realism may help India shape the emerging multipolar order. And that ultimately may be the strategic question facing India today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rani. You've packed so much into those 35, 40 minutes. I think thank you also for helping us understand the various complexities that go on to make this very tricky and muddled concept, which is clearly a contested concept for a variety of reasons. And I think one takeaway, something that really stood out for me, is that when we try and understand strategic autonomy, I think, and this is leaning from what you said and also from what I understand, that it's a function in part of US uncertainty. It is also in part a reflection of India's rising capacity, but how is also in part a reflection of how that capacity gets constrained by China's rise So there's multiple strands, and so depending, it's like the proverbial blind man and the elephant. Depending on which aspect we are looking at, we tend to kind of do a as I said, we are prone to navel gazing, so we tend to get the concept wrong. So I think I have several questions, but I think I'll wait to hear and listen to those in the room and on Zoom. Let me, with that, open the floor for questions. I think we already have a few running. So please, so let me read these. There's a question from a visiting fellow from Cuts, Puru Singh, who's asked, what lessons can Indian diaspora learn from the Jewish diaspora in the US, ultimately to support US-India relations? And a follow-up question about where does the Indian Ocean feature in US priorities?
Wow. Well, as you know, I guess I would thank you for this question. It's an interesting question to compare different kinds of diasporas, particularly in the US context, I think. As you know, it's not quite the same because many Jewish Americans see themselves squarely as Americans, and that's different from holding a H-1B visa or something of that sort. So are we comparing all similarly? But there is an issue of a significant rise over the last 2 decades in particular of Indians from Silicon Valley to in many echelons of multilateral institutions, the IMF, for example, when we think of Geeta Gopinath, who rose to become the chief economist and number 2 of the institution. So over the past couple of decades, India's rise has been visual also in the United States in a similar way to I think this is what the question is thinking about. And I think in terms of lessons it sort of depends on what you're looking at. Are these lessons in terms of Indian diaspora sort of supporting a closer relationship, right, between India and the respective country? I would say that the Indian diaspora has grown in influence in the United States. It's one of the wealthiest diasporas. It is one of the more influential diasporas in the United States. It might not look like it in the current political environment where there's so much focus on H-1B and how that might disproportionately impact Indians, that there seem to be these tensions. But actually, when you look at the data in terms of who are the Indian Americans and Indians in the United States, they are one of the wealthiest, often, disproportionately represented in the Silicon Valley, et cetera. And so to keep those linkages and also use the diaspora in ways that enable closer linkages, Israel has been able to do that quite well of recent. India could do more of that. Second part of the question, would you mind reading that again?
Yes, sure. It's he asks, what is it? Where does the Indian Ocean region?
Oh, the Indian Ocean, right. So the Indian Ocean, I think India's focus historically was on the Indian Ocean. I think it needs to expand, right? India talks about the Indo-Pacific, but where is India in the Pacific, right? I mean, as you mentioned, I've done some work on India's, development cooperation, but really it's minuscule. There's much, if you read the history, much history and engagement. I've been based the last summer and and just in January in Indonesia and Jakarta, when you read the history, those links, the history is quite, the links go back centuries, right? And yet there is so little focus, for example, on India and Indonesia and engaging actually into the Pacific, despite having, the diaspora is not only in the US and in Africa, it's also eastward, right? From Singapore to Fiji to Indonesia. So I think India's focus on the Indian Ocean has always been there from Sri Lanka, and it has over the last few decades expanded, with its engagement in the Maldives, etc. What needs to happen is actually engaging further with ASEAN countries, with going and, there's clear interest between India and Indonesia, and yet you see so little engagement thinking about how both countries actually have very similar strategic interests and how there would be a win-win from engaging more and cooperating more.
So plenty, the flowing questions are flowing thick and fast. Rani, let me warn you. So we have another question. The next question is on, was India's non-alignment in the Nehru years realist and pragmatic, or governed by an ideological commitment, unlike the strategic autonomy, multi-alignment practiced by India today? Is there a difference?
So was NAM under Nehru, was it more ideological? Yes, it's the short answer to that.
Short and sweet.
I really do think that, but it was also a very different time,
Yes.
right? You come out of colonialism,
Yes.
and there's this wealth of goodwill that with other countries to engage. And there's a realization that India was poor. It, had to put significant investments into education, right? Sort of to bring up the capacity, et cetera, and that there were clear interests if it would work with other countries. India's rise has in some ways led, I think, India to forget that there's strength in numbers, right? So while the non-alignment of, the post-independence years was really driven by this sort of ideology of wanting, the Cold War and wanting to navigate between these two poles. Today, I think, first of all, it's a much more complex world. It's the linkages, it's not as simple, right? It's not you align here or here. There's China, there's Russia, there's US, but there are many other rising powers also. So while I think it was more ideological, I think it's also understandable that it was more ideological because India was just coming out from under the yoke of colonialism. And so there was, a interest in engaging with other countries that had just emerged from colonialism.
And also the difference in capacity.
Yes.
It was a poor country which just emerged, and now
over 60% of the population was
on the cusp of a 4 trillion. So there is a materiality of power as well.
Exactly. So India's rise in many ways, I think, led it to pursue this strategic autonomy, which worked in many ways in the world leading up to Trump 2.0, right? But I think Trump has really disrupted the global order. He not only vis-a-vis India, but vis-a-vis close allies, such as, NATO allies or the UK, et cetera. My husband's Canadian, think about the US-Canada relationship right now. So in this world where there's huge disruption, I think it's important for India to rethink that, how does it achieve its aims? And what might have worked before can continue in some ways. But again, I'm back to the sort of strength in numbers. What worked non-alignment in the 50s for very different reasons could well work again today, because if you're negotiating one-on-one, India is always on its back foot, right? How much leverage can it have? but then you organize with other powers, and it's a very different environment. And that was the beauty of the non-aligned movement. It wasn't just India, it was several countries. And that is what enabled it to chart this path. And I think it's worth thinking about that again.
So Rani, we put these questions up
okay,
because
right.
I just thought I shouldn't come in the way between you and the audience. You can read them yourself if you wish. I can of course read it aloud for you, whatever.
Okay, did you want to
Yeah.
jump in
Yeah.
on this?
Yes, please.
How does this work? Okay.
No, you shouldn't have.
Thank you, Rani.
Yeah.
And welcome back to CPR.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you two questions actually. One just piggybacking on the previous one, because I don't think of India's strategy before as being vastly different from what it's doing right now, or not from what it's doing right now, but from what you're suggesting it should do right now. Because you just mentioned yourself that the whole non-alignment movement was really about building coalitions with countries that were emerging from colonial rule, the global south. It's just that the list that you had there on the slides today will be different from the one that was there earlier. But I think that India, what India is doing right now, actually, I don't think is very clear to any of us. But I think what India did in the past was definitely to have this kind of ideological, moral sort of policy and build coalitions with others, and take positions which were consistent with that ideological stance, which was anti-colonialist, anti-occupation, and sort of speaking out about that. So I would just say that completely agree with you that coalitions are so important, both in international and domestic political scenarios. I just think that India's been doing that, and so in that sense, if your suggestion is what India has been doing, I'm not sure what India is doing right now. It's not very clear to me what the overall policy is. The second question I have is that when Stephen Kotkin was here about a year ago, and to be fair to him, he was here before Trump took over, just a month before or something. It's very refreshing for me to hear your perspective, because his perspective about what India should do was really aligned with the US. And obviously, it's not very clear what India is doing, but it seems to be that it is aligning very strongly with the US and sort of abandoning what you're saying it should be doing and what I'm saying it has been doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess it's a question of nuance, right? Because when I look at the past decade or so of Indian foreign policy, I see a foreign policy that has aligned much closer with the US than it did before.
Exactly.
Right? And so to me, that closer alignment meant that it was in fact less open to other kind of coalitions. And I think what is happening now is that closer alignment that had been happening on, over the past decades, really since Clinton, but, accelerated in some ways. There was Clinton, Bush, but recently, the past 4 years, also under Biden, of Russia's war in Ukraine, clearly put pressure on India in some ways to take a stand. But the US looked the other way with India's rapid sort of scaling up of buying Russian oil. And that was a testament to how important the relationship with India was to the US, right? That they would look the other way on certain issues. I think that has changed. I think we're really living in a different environment where Trump is less willing to, it's all about sort of one, less willing to look the other way. And ultimately, in this environment where it's transactional, where it's just, what can India give the US in terms of tariffs, et cetera, in those negotiations, how do you bargain in that environment? Because it is a very different bilateral relationship than it was just a year and a half ago. I think we can't deny that, right? It was very different under Trump than it is now. So it's the same for many other countries, right? And so I think in that environment where not only are these bilateral relationships under strain, but the overall global structure that the post-war global structure, multilateral institutions, whether it's NATO or WTO, whether it's the IMF or the UN, these post-war structures under strain like they were never before. And so while India could rely in the past on some of these structures to give it sort of some space, I think that is no longer there in the same way, right? When these institutions are under such severe strain, what do you do? Where do you go, and how do you engage with the United States? So while I think very understandable that India engage in strategic autonomy, and of course every country really should, because you are trying to put the best foot forward for the country. This is not an environment where just pursuing that strategy alone will benefit India. So my argument, I guess, is of nuance. I'm not saying do away with that policy. I'm saying that it needs to be supplemented by more engagement in coalitions. And there, I guess I would differ a little bit to say that while India has maintained, and engaged with the multiplicity of countries, partnerships, etc., it has maintained more autonomy than might be good for it in engaging in partnerships. We can talk about RCEP, we can talk about, other kinds of minilaterals or whatnot. I think it's also time to think outside the box, not just the established coalitions, but it was starkly, came to me quite a bit talking to think tanks in Indonesia, where Indonesia is a big market, it's a big country, they have many interests that overlap with India's, and yet there's little engagement in thinking about how can one make this a win-win by engaging with Indonesia, by engaging with Japan, and thinking about, well, maybe there are other kind of free trade agreements, or maybe there are other kind of coalitions. I think it's a time, because of the changing nature of the global order and a global order that the US helped build and support, and is now, it is the one actually undermining that order. This is, one is at a strategic inflection point. And I think it's important for India to rethink its policy. Is it really beneficial to it? I think rising and middle powers globally, India and beyond, need to rethink foreign policy. I guess so. I don't know if that answers it entirely. I think we disagree on some, but it's sort of an issue of nuance rather than saying, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. Okay, right. Do you, Partha?
No, before that, couple of questions. In front of Samir Hussain, in such a fragmented global order, how should India prepare to deal with the Chinese threats?
Yeah, good question. I think there again, China is still the major, I don't want to say threat, but the major actor that is important for the US to think about, right? In terms of where threats come from, on the economic front, on the political front. And so there are commonality of interests vis-a-vis China that would help India to continue to engage with the US. But I think there are other actors who have similar worries with regard to China. So I guess my thinking there is that India has relied quite a bit on being able to piggyback in a way on the United States. And this is now a time to continue to do that, but also think about other coalitions that might enable India to engage with other countries that have similar concerns vis-a-vis India, not only in the neighborhood, but beyond too.
We also have a question from Sham, Rani. Sham, please go ahead. Yes, he raised his hand.
Nimmi, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
So welcome back, Rani. Thank you very much, and you really helped us to process many of the desperate things happening for the last 1 year or so. So my question is this: for most of the middle powers, the real challenge today, in my opinion, I want to know your view, is that there is no global bipolar rivalry the way it was between United States and Soviet Union. Initially, maybe early 2000s, the expectation was that both China and the United States would compete everywhere, be it Nicaragua, or Angola, or Korea, or Vietnam. And the rivalry between US and China today looks more bilateral. There could be one or two flare-ups on issues like Taiwan, maybe their bilateral relations, technology transfer, tariffs, and all that. So, in a situation where the two major superpowers are not really at each other's throats, what would what could the middle powers do? Be it US NATO allies or India or Japan or Germany, what can they do? Do you agree with my view that US China bilateral competition is not going towards uh, across the board confrontation?
Let me make sure I understood the question correctly, and nice to hear you, Cham. So you're saying that under Trump, this sort of what seemed to be heading towards a bilateral sort of two superpower rivalry is no longer as clear or stark. And given that, I think underlying this is perhaps a question of, is the US then willing, should there be a Taiwan scenario, does the US even see this as a strategically important issue where it would come to the rescue, right? Is that where you're heading with that question?
Yes, yes. It seems one of the arguments within Chinese establishment now is that this is the opportune time for them to invade Taiwan because Trump wouldn't really care for it. I mean, I don't know about that, but that's quite, yes, that's what I actually mean. I don't see any bipolar rivalry across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's interesting when you look at the tariffs that Trump has imposed, higher on India than on China, interestingly, right? So there is this question of where does the Trump administration see a strategic threat? What I'm hearing is that from, and these are some people in the administration, others outside, that this is still a worry. But under Trump, if push came to shove, there is this question of how far would the US be willing to go to sort of support and put resources as far away as Taiwan. I think this is even more a question now, given what's happening in Iran, right? At a time when, the war seems to be spreading. There's no logical end in sight anytime soon. as you said, this might be an opportune time. At the same time, I think we can't forget that China is also under pressure. It gets a significant part of its resources right through the Straits of Hormuz, and we know what's happening there. So I wonder if this would really be a good time for China also. I think this situation in the Gulf is putting significant pressure on China also. So, but this is a particular moment where it's all the more important that countries like Japan, India, China, Indonesia come together and think about their common strategic interests and think about how they might come together, how they might think about tariffs and trade. You know, we've seen the oil prices kind of be very volatile, going up, going over $100 a barrel, then coming down. I think this is likely to carry on, and this might well impact India the longer this goes on. Certainly, you know, no country is really immune from dependency on resources that come from the Middle East. So I think this is even more a moment where there could be worries about China, but China also has its own problems to deal with. You know, how to try and increase its economic growth rates when oil prices are likely to go through the roof, and you know, how does it ensure its continued supply? So at this point, I would say you might not be hearing so much from the US about China, but in the policy circles, there's still a recognition that the major threat, if any, to the US would be coming from China and not from Russia or other sources. So so I think, you know, on the one hand, I think what you hear from the Trump administration is not necessarily what some in the policy circles are saying. Also, of course, depends on how much Trump listens to them. But I do think that the point you've raised actually sort of supports my point that this is even a more opportune time for India to rethink its foreign policy and engage with other countries to prevent a push, perhaps potentially, by China towards Taiwan.
I think, you know, that's a very interesting caveat, just to my 2 cents on this, Rani, because I think it's a very useful caveat you threw in there about the limitations that are there on across the spectrum. And it's something which is, you know, it has such deep ironies implicit in it, because as rising powers, they've been claimants for a new of a new world order. And yet there are these, if the Iran crisis and the war tells us anything, it is a clear stress test for a variety, for across the, you know, not just for the US and for the combatants, but also for those who punishes silence. It is going to, you know, push countries beyond their comfort levels. And I'm reminded of a recent piece I read by Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon about, you know, paraphrasing, but I got the second half, which is absolutely spot on, which is very evocative, which is about talking about the new world order. And he says, careful what you wish for. So it's actually, you know, in a sense, you captured some of that, those, you and Sham captured some of those. I think the next question there, if we take them in the order,
So Ajit Lal,
Ajit,
yes,
please.
what would appear to be the weaknesses and threats for India if a SWOT is attempted?
SWOT.
A SWOT, which is
SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis that I
Okay, do you want to elaborate on what would appear to be the weakness and threats for India if a swap is attempted?
It looks at strengths and weaknesses on both sides.
On both sides.
You come out with a balance.
What is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and
Yeah.
threats?
Okay, I mean, I think I did that in my talk overall. In terms of, I think the weakness of India in many ways I think it had space, say under the previous administration in the US, to simultaneously increasingly buy cheap discounted oil from Russia, engage with, in the region and beyond, have an increasing etc. I think that space has shrunk, if not. And not acknowledging that that space has shrunk, and not engaging with other potential threats that India might have to deal with vis-a-vis China, doesn't behoove India in the long term, right? I think it would be in India's interest to get together with other countries with similar interests, also in the long term, to address this sort of narrowed or constrained foreign policy environment that has just rapidly changed over the past year. Okay, Artha, nice to see you online or see your question online. Sorry to have missed you here. So 2 questions from him. First, could you please discuss the potential contributions that India could bring to the various coalitions? In the EU-India FTA, do you see India's role as both a consumer from the EU point of view and a producer, India's point of view? Can both these roles be politically palatable in a EU that is increasingly becoming politically insular, given the rise of leaders like Lionel Le Pen? Okay, yes. Okay, so one is this question of contributions that India could bring to the various coalitions. I mean, India is a huge market. India is, depending on where you look, 4th, 5th largest economy globally. It has seen significant, it's been one of the, has had the largest global economic growth rate. I believe it's the largest, or certainly among the largest, right? So there's India's rise, not only on the political front, but also in the economic front. It has a huge market domestically. That's clearly where EU comes in. It wanted to be able to tap into that market. So I think there are many contributions that India could bring, both on the economic front, when we can think of, FTA-like deals, rising defense cooperation, where India has many strengths and its weaknesses could be helped by engaging with other countries that have better hardware in areas where India might be somewhat weaker. So I think that's how I would see it. India, especially on the economic front, there's a reason that the EU has been negotiating with India for 2 decades, right? It's not as if India was always a large country with a huge middle class that has grown over the last 2 decades. And so it's clearly, there are many other countries who would, on the economic front, like to engage with India. So we can think more about those coalitions. And I think the second question, Partha, was about the movement to the right, whether we look at the AfD in Germany or Marie Le Pen, the Le Pen question in France. There is already a right-wing government in Italy, Orban in Hungary, etc. So this question of coalition, can I just see the end of, oh, it's right there. Okay. So how do I see that going, where, can I just second at the bar level? Is this the same question that I had about, no, there we go. It's like, to that question. Yes, so, both as a consumer and as a producer, I think there are, yes, so I think that first question is about the rightward movement in many European countries and the anti-immigration movement in many countries. And is there enough space for India then to engage? And I think there is. I mean, we do have the FTA, EU, India. I think there might be openings also at the university research level, and I think it's important for India to think about engaging there. So I think the FTA is clear that despite this rightward movement in different countries at the EU level, but also at the individual country level, there's clear interest also because of what is happening between the EU and the individual member countries and the United States. So that was the first question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please go.
And then can I see the second question, which was below? Okay, second. Disruptions bring countries together, strengthening insular political. Well, I think right now, what we are not seeing countries coming together, right? Each country is trying to navigate the space because it's sort of a crisis situation, and they're just trying to deal with a constantly changing tariff policy on the United States front. But I think this is a time. So what I'm seeing is sort of an insular approach. What I think is needed, and where I think countries are increasingly going to see space and a win-win for them, is when they engage in coalitions. And I think that's where India and other countries need to go in this sort of disrupted world order.
So just on that, if I may, in the interest of time, since we have to wrap up, there's a question directly on that. If India moves from realism without alignment towards coalition building, how can it ensure that these coalitions do not gradually limit its strategic autonomy?
So if India moves towards
the alternative framework,
right? So engages more in coalitions, but how might one be sure that these coalitions don't actually constrain? I think history is where you need to also look to, right? The non-aligned movement in the end really helped India navigate its rise in, its sort of recognition as a significant player, despite being a poor country in the 50s, 60s, 70s during the Cold War into the 80s. Post-Cold War, India kind of slowly drew back from that. We saw India's rise, in the 1990s and since. And that rise has been accompanied by a sort of movement away from coalitions in a way, particularly over the past decade, when the United States gave it sort of more space to, where it was supported India's rise as a way also for the US to band together vis-a-vis China. So I think there's always been this worry in Indian foreign policy since the Cold War. If you engage too closely, will this constrain India, right? Will sort of engaging with Japan then limit its ability to, develop increased trade with China or whatnot? And I think India's own history is an example that India has managed quite well when it has had coalition, when it has engaged in whether they're trade coalitions or defense partnerships. But I guess I would say that kind of moving closer to the United States while having these sort of different partnerships worked in an era that was very different. We have seen such a break over the past year in terms of, how the relevance of an institution like WHO, the relevance of WTO, right? Or, engagement in a war like we are seeing with Iran, with the UN Security Council or the UN playing no role, let alone, the US Congress. So I think that kind of worry should not be the overarching sort of concern,
Yes.
because the flip side of that is actually much more important to think about. If India does not engage with like-minded countries, it's the space for it to negotiate and to buttress its rise is going to only become narrower.
So, Rani, would you have time to take on one more question? There are several more, but I think we need to also, in the interest of time, I need to also wrap up. My comms team also alerted me. So there's one question on how, just to paraphrase, how the US has been changing the goalposts in international affairs. And this will have implications for years to come in US relationships with its friends. How is this perceived in the US itself?
Oh, that's a good question. I think many of us are shocked by, not only how the US has engaged with neighboring countries, where it has a long history of, a strong relationship, but also with NATO allies. That's been sort of the bedrock of sort of post-war European relations, has been that NATO relationship, right? And sort of the promise of, that the US would stand by. I think it's clear that there's huge disappointments amongst all allies. Something that really took decades to build, American soft power and goodwill post-war, has been fragmented, has really been shattered in many ways within the space of little more than a year. And once shattered, that's hard to build back and put together again, right? It's sort of Humpty Dumpty's shattered and you cannot just glue it back together, because that trust is gone in many relationships. So I think we're facing a situation that even, post-Trump, I think whether it be a Democratic president who would come next, we have midterm elections, maybe that will change some of the dynamic. It will be difficult to go back to pre-Trump 2.0. I think it just has really, what I'm hearing, whether it's Germany or people working in Canada, or whether it's, with partnerships even as far away, Singapore, there's been such disillusionment, 70 years of post-war, 80 years of post-war sort of engagement, relationship, really shattered within a year and a few months. I don't think that will be so easily put together. I think there are many in the US who don't support certain foreign policy engagements and would like to see a change, but it might be too late to salvage and go back to, a US-EU relationship that existed pre-Trump. And I think countries are already planning and realizing that that trust has been broken in many ways, and they need to engage with and rethink that relationship. I wish I could tell you something more as an American, you know.
Thank you,
yes.
and thank you, Rani, and also apologies to some of our participants who had more questions, but unfortunately we need to wrap up. We just won't be able to fit in many of these, but we'll share them with you.
Okay, that would be great. Yes, it would be food for thought for me. I would
Yes. So thank you, Rani. Let me then thank you on behalf of all of us here at CPR and who have joined us for really unpacking the complexities of this. And also, I think part of the reason why there's so much of confusion and contestation about this concept is that its meaning is changing, as you hinted at. Its meaning is changing because the system is changing. So it is in a way it reflects that it's a system, it's a concept nested in a system in flux, and it reflects that. So where we are expecting to see neat, orderly sort of categories, it breaks down because it's reflecting a world order which is riven with tensions and is messy, and therefore the concept itself will be messy and untidy, and it'll be full of strewn. It will be shot through with contradictions. And I think one thing that one really stands out from today's discussion is just that this is as a concept, we cannot expect those. It's constantly undergoing,
evolving.
It's evolving. That's right. So I think with that, we will today wrap up today's. Do you have any question? I'm sorry. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. So we'll just wrap up today's and thank today's discussion, and thank you, Rani, once again.
Thank you, Nimmi,
for taking out the time and
TPR
also for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you.